From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
So the current situation is in Yemen, you've got more than 18 million people in need of humanitarian aid. The figures are even worse than in Syria, that we hear a lot more about. And the US is heavily involved in the conflict in Yemen. They're providing weapons in the form of bombs to Saudi Arabia. But most crucially, they're also implicated in the refueling system. And they hold huge sway over the involvement of Saudi Arabia. And they could actually stop that bombing campaign tomorrow if they decided to withdraw that support. But they choose not to.
As the U.S.-backed Saudi bombing campaign continues in Yemen, a humanitarian crisis is intensifying. UNICEF says one child is dying every 10 minutes in Yemen. We'll speak with award-winning journalist Iona Craig. Then we look at Donald Trump's proposal to build a registry of Muslims living in the United States.
We did it during World War II with Japanese, which, you know, call it what you will, maybe wrong.
You're not proposing we go back to the days of internment camps, I hope.
We'll speak with Democratic Congressmember Mike Honda of California, who lived in a Japanese-American internment camp as a child. And we'll look at a New York Times investigation after a crime, the price of a second chance, looking at how the poor can often not afford to benefit from programs which could lead to their criminal records being cleared. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Syria, the chaotic evacuation of eastern Aleppo continues amidst ongoing fighting, punctuated by a series of short-lived ceasefires. This morning, the Syrian civil defense, known as the White Helmets, say a civilian evacuation convoy was attacked by Syrian government forces, killing one person and wounding at least 4 more, including a medical worker. On Wednesday, the Syrian army and its Russian ally resumed shelling and airstrikes against eastern Aleppo despite a ceasefire. This is a spokesperson for the UN Secretary General.
The UN is deeply concerned by reports of fighting in Aleppo today, despite the announcement of a ceasefire agreement last night. Any continued fighting leaves thousands of civilians in the direct line of fire. The safety and security of tens of thousands of men, women, and children still trapped in eastern Aleppo remains precarious. We urgently call for a pause in fighting to allow people who wish to leave safely the besieged eastern Aleppo for a destination of their choice.
The ongoing fall of Aleppo is considered a decisive battle in the Syrian civil war. It comes after eastern Aleppo has been besieged and bombarded by months by government and military forces. Anti-government activists have called the fall of Aleppo doomsday, while Russia has described it as a victory against terrorists and jihadists. The battle's been marked by increasingly polarized coverage with propaganda on both sides. On Wednesday, the Syrian ambassador to the United Nations was accused of lying to the UN Security Council during a recent emergency meeting by showing a photo he falsely claimed depicted a Syrian soldier helping a female civilian in Aleppo. In fact, the photo was taken in Fallujah and shows an Iraqi soldier helping an Iraqi woman in June of 2016. Meanwhile, in Sarajevo, hundreds of survivors of the years-old siege of the city in the 1990s gathered Wednesday in solidarity with the civilians of Aleppo.
We know how it feels to be abandoned and forgotten. We remember how it is when there are no replies to the screams for help. So today we stand united with Aleppo, Syria, and all other towns where people suffer.
More than 10,000 people died during a 1,400-day siege of Sarajevo. It was the longest siege in modern history. In the United States, Donald Trump's transition team is now attempting to distance itself from a 74-part questionnaire at the Department of Energy, requesting the names of employees working on climate-related projects and the names of employees who have attended climate talks over the last 5 years. Many have denounced the move as the creation of an enemies list. The Energy Department said earlier this week it would not turn over the names, following the widespread pushback by both the department and environmental groups. An official with Trump's transition team said this morning the questionnaire was not authorized or part of our standard protocol, unquote. President-elect Donald Trump met with a slew of technology leaders at Trump Tower Wednesday, including Amazon's Jeff Bezos, Apple's Tim Cook, Facebook's Sheryl Sandberg, and others. The meeting was organized by Trump transition team member, billionaire Peter Thiel, who famously drove the news website Gawker out of business by secretly bankrolling a controversial lawsuit by wrestler Hulk Hogan against Gawker Media earlier this year. Trump's adult children, Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric, were also at the meeting. Trump's inclusion of his children in political meetings has sparked increasing concern. The topics discussed during the 90-minute meeting were reportedly immigration, education, and trade with China. There are few details about the conversation, however, because journalists were forced to leave the meeting after only a few minutes. Donald Trump has not given a press conference for 140 days now, or over 4 months. His last news conference was when he called on Russia to hack Hillary Clinton's email servers. Trump was slated to give his first news conference as president-elect today on whether and how he would disentangle himself from his vast business empire before taking office. But his spokesperson said earlier this week he's postponing it until sometime in January. A handful of Senate Republicans have come out saying they may block John Bolton from being confirmed as Deputy Secretary of State if Trump picks him. Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul says he would block John Bolton's potential confirmation, saying, quote, "There's something to be said for one of the top diplomats in the country being diplomatic," unquote. Bolton was the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations under George W. Bush, during which time Bolton famously talked about lopping off the top 10 stories of the United Nations headquarters. Trump's pick for Secretary of State, ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson, has also sparked concern and pushback from Senate Democrats and Republicans, many of whom are concerned about Tillerson's close ties to Russia. Newly released documents have revealed retired Army General Michael Flynn, whom Trump has chosen as national security advisor, shared classified military information without authorization while he was the U.S. military intelligence chief in Afghanistan. A secret 2010 military investigation concluded Flynn inappropriately shared classified information with British and Australian officials, including secret information about the CIA. General Flynn was not disciplined for the intelligence breach, and it is not known the extent of the information shared because the investigation itself remains classified. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio has endorsed Minnesota Congressmember Keith Ellison to be the next chair of the Democratic National Committee, adding to a chorus of voices supporting Ellison as the future head of the party. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders has also backed Ellison, who's the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the first Muslim elected to Congress. Ellison has said he'll step down from Congress if elected DNC chair in February, so he can devote all of his time to the job. Labor Secretary Tom Perez is slated to announce today he'll also run for head of the DNC. Perez is expected to have the support of the White House. According to NBC, unnamed U.S. intelligence officials say Russian President Vladimir Putin was personally involved in the effort to meddle in the 2016 U.S. presidential election to help Donald Trump win. The CIA has accused Russia of intervening, and President Obama has ordered a review of Russia's role. President-elect Donald Trump has called the claims ridiculous. This comes as a New York Times investigation has revealed the FBI was aware a DNC computer had been hacked as early as September 2015, allegedly by a team known as the Dukes, which the FBI says is linked to the Russian government. The New York Times investigation goes on to report an FBI agent called the DNC repeatedly to inform them of the security breach, but that the party's tech support contractor did almost nothing with the information, believing it might simply be a prank call. The Times also reports the hackers used a relatively low-tech means of infiltrating the emails of top targets, including Hillary Clinton's campaign chair, John Podesta, whose emails were successfully hacked and then leaked over the summer, generating a slew of negative coverage of the Clinton campaign. The tactic is known as phishing, sending an email to a user asking them to change their password or click on a link in order to gain access to their entire account. John Podesta, in fact, did change his password after receiving one of those phishing emails after being advised to do so by one of his aides. Meanwhile, Yahoo has admitted as many as 1 billion accounts were hacked in 2013 13. Yahoo says the hack involved private user information, including names, phone numbers, birth dates, passwords, and security questions. In September, Yahoo also admitted that 500 million of its accounts were hacked in 2014. These two hacks are the largest known security breaches of a single company in history. Yahoo says it's not known who's behind the newly disclosed hack. Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte has boasted he personally carried out extrajudicial killings while he was the mayor of Davao. Speaking on Monday night, he said, quote, "I'd go around in Davao with a motorcycle with a big bike around, and I would just patrol the streets looking for trouble also. I was really looking for a confrontation so I could kill," unquote. President Duterte has long been accused of overseeing death squads in Davao, prompting Human Rights Watch to call him the death squad mayor. As president, he's launched a brutal so-called war on drugs that's seen thousands of people killed by police and vigilantes since this summer. In news on Standing Rock, North Dakota, the Justice Department says it will not comply with North Dakota's request to send 100 federal officers to aid in the ongoing police crackdown against Native American water protectors fighting the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline. The Justice Department has said, however, it has given training and technical assistance to local law enforcement officers who've been sued for excessive use of force, including firing rubber bullets, tear gas, pepper spray, and water cannons in freezing temperatures at the water protectors, injuring hundreds of people. In more news on Standing Rock, water protector Red Fawn Fallis is still in custody and had a preliminary hearing Monday on a federal charge of possession of a weapon by a felon. She originally faced charges of attempted murder of a police officer. Charges were later dropped by Morton County, reportedly for lack of evidence. She's been in prison since October 27th, when hundreds of police raided a frontline resistance camp. A video from that day shows nearly a dozen officers pinning her to the ground and arresting her. This video does not show Red Fawn Fallis with a gun. You can hear the sound of 3 pops in the video. In North Carolina, Republican legislators called a surprise special session Wednesday with the aim of restricting some of incoming Democratic Governor Roy Cooper's power, following a contentious and close election between him and the outgoing Republican Governor Pat McCrory. Democratic lawmakers protested the surprise session, calling it unconstitutional. The North Carolina Republican lawmakers are attempting to impose measures to require state Senate approval for all of the governor's cabinet picks, as well as measures to strip him of the power to appoint University of North Carolina trustees. Another effort by Republican lawmakers to pack the North Carolina State Supreme Court appears to have been defeated. Republicans were threatening to try to add 2 more justices to the court after the Democratic African-American judge Mike Morgan defeated a Republican incumbent in the November election, tilting the court 4-3 to the Democrats. The North Carolina Supreme Court has 7 judges for the past 80 years. In West Virginia, a government worker who sparked outrage after calling Michelle Obama an ape in heels is slated to get her job back after being removed over the racist comments. Pamela Ramsey Taylor was a director of the Clay County Development Corporation. She made the comments in a social media post in November after Donald Trump's election victory. The mayor of Clay, Beverly Whaling, also resigned after responding to the post, quote, "Just made my day, Pam," unquote. And Peru has launched its first daily national news broadcast in the indigenous language of Quechua for the first time in Peruvian history. Millions of people in Peru and many more in Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia, Argentina, and Chile speak fluent Quechua, which was the dominant language of the vast Inca Empire that ruled the region before the Spanish conquest. The broadcast is part of an effort to combat centuries of oppression against indigenous Peruvians and their languages. This is a clip of the first broadcast.
How are you today, brothers, sisters, and fellow citizens of Pleasant Heart? I hope this is a good day for all of you. With a lot of joy, we are here to spread the news. We are very joyful, and we thank you with all our hearts, the warm welcome our program has received.
I hope it's a good day for all of you. I'm happy because I'm here at the beginning of this news program in Quechua.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. At least one child dies every 10 minutes in Yemen. That's the conclusion of a report just published by the UN Children's Agency, UNICEF. The report also found that there has been a 200% increase since 2014 in children suffering from severe acute malnutrition, with almost 500,000 affected. Nearly 2.2 million children are in need of urgent care. This comes as the country's health system is on the verge of collapse, in part due to the ongoing U.S.-backed Saudi bombing of Yemen. Since the bombing began in March 2015, more than 10,000 people have died and 3 million have been displaced in the conflict. Saudi Arabia launched its offensive to target Houthi rebels loyal to the former president, Ali Abdul Saleh. Saudi Arabia and the United States accuse Iran of supplying weapons to the Houthis. The U.S. has been a major backer of Saudi Arabia's bombing campaign. In 2015 alone, the United States approved more than $20 billion in military sales to Saudi Arabia. U.S.-made munitions have repeatedly been found at the scene of Saudi-led bombings where civilians have been killed. Facing mounting pressure from human rights groups, the Obama administration announced earlier this week that the U.S. would halt the sale of some weapons to Saudi Arabia. White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest spoke about Yemen on Tuesday.
Long expressed some pretty significant concerns about the high rate of civilian casualties in Yemen. And many of those casualties have been as a result of operations carried out by the Saudi-led coalition in the region. Not all of them. There have also been civilian casualties as a result of operations carried out by their adversaries as well. But of course, the United States is playing a role in supporting the Saudi-led coalition. And in light of the high rate of civilian casualties, the president ordered a review of the kind of assistance that the United States provides to the Saudis as they undertake this effort. That review is ongoing, but there are a couple of steps that the United States is prepared to take to change some of the assistance that we provide. That includes refocusing our efforts to support the Saudis when it comes to enhancing their border security and their territorial integrity.
White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest speaking Tuesday. While Washington is halting the sale of some weapons to Saudi Arabia, the U.S. will continue to refuel coalition aircraft and provide intelligence to Saudi Arabia. Human rights groups are calling for a more comprehensive ban on U.S. assistance. To talk more about the situation, we're joined by Iona Craig, a journalist who is based in Sana'a from 2010 to 2015 as the Yemen correspondent for the Times of London. She was awarded the 2016 Orwell Prize for her reporting there. She has received the Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you in studio. This UNICEF report, one Yemeni child dies every 10 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, this is a combination of the humanitarian situation in Yemen of malnutrition as well as access to medical care. So this is from preventable diseases. And in the process of the conflict, you've got the issue over the blockade of the Saudis preventing food coming into the country when Yemen relies on imports for 90% of its food. And then to add to that is the situation of the medical facilities in Yemen. 58 hospitals, more than 58 hospitals now, have been bombed by the coalition airstrikes, and people just do not have access to medical care in a way that they did before the war. And also, you know, just the expense and the access of getting to places and getting people to hospitals and facilities has been, you know, severely affected by the conflict. So this is preventable diseases and malnutrition combined is creating a devastating situation for the children in Yemen right now.
Could you say a little bit more about the blockade? Who's imposed the blockade, and what all does it include in addition to preventing food from arriving in Yemen?
Well, the reason the Saudis put the blockade in place in the first place was they said, to prevent weapons, particularly from they said, Iran, going into the Houthis, who they're currently fighting, and the forces of Ali Abdullah Saleh. Now, that blockade has been eased somewhat, and now the UN is responsible for boats getting into particularly the northern areas, the most populated areas of Yemen. But the problem was, on top of that, even once those boats were being allowed in, the coalition then bombed the port of Hodeidah, which they hit directly the cranes that are needed to offload food into the port. So it now takes a huge amount of time to get the food offloaded, and it means only specific boats with their own cranes on board can get that food off. Add to that a decision made by the Yemeni government in exile, who are currently in Riyadh, and President Hadi. They made a decision to move the central bank of Yemen that had tried to remain neutral through the conflict, which had been obviously in the capital Sana'a, which was under Houthi control. He took a unilateral decision in September then to move the central bank to Yemen without any planning whatsoever. And the central bank is crucial to underwriting the import of food into the country by private companies, and it means they're not able to do that now. So you're looking at the prospect of basically wheat supplies running out at the end of January without any imports being able to come in. So in the next few weeks and certainly months, it doesn't look like the central bank is going to be able to get this system up and running until probably the spring, March, April time at best. It basically freezes the ability of private companies then to be importing food into Yemen. So the situation is only going to get worse now in the next 3 months.
The U.S. military weapons are still coming in, though. Is that right? First of all, why did it take the U.S. to this long to stop supplying Saudi Arabia? But explain what it's supplying and what it's not and how it's getting it through other countries.
Well, of course, that is a crucial question. Why did it take this long? You know, there was data out in the middle of last year saying that 60% of the casualties were being caused by Saudi-led coalition airstrikes. I think it all came to a head really at the beginning of October when there was a very high-profile strike in the middle of Sana'a that hit a funeral and killed over 140 civilians in a double-tap strike. So that was first responders being killed as well in a second strike after the initial attack.
What happened there?
This was a funeral in the middle of Sana'a. There were a lot of Houthi dignitaries there and senior figures within the Houthis and Saleh officials. And they had gathered in more than 1,000 people in one building. But amongst those Houthi officials, of course, were hundreds of civilians. And that building was bombed twice. And I think that's what brought everything to a head, and concerns, I think, probably from the US government then that they were going to be complicit in war crimes. And there was, you know, mounting evidence of war crimes, and certainly I'd seen it myself on the ground of civilian targets being repeatedly hit. And so the US are now taking this decision to stop or suspend, anyway, the sale of precision-guided weapons. This doesn't mean that they will stop selling them to other members of the coalition as well, because this is a multinational coalition. You have the Emirates involved, the UAE as well. And it also doesn't mean that they're not going to stop selling them other equipment, such as attack helicopters, and supporting them militarily, as they've already said, for border control. But you know, there's no way that they can prevent those weapons that are still being sold for being used inside Yemen anyway. And as I say, other members of the coalition still using bombs that are being sold. And of course, the British are not going to stop what they're doing, which has been similar to the US, and they've authorised the sale of over £3 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia over the course of the war as well, and there is no indication that they're going to stop doing that.
And what about the U.S. still providing refueling to coalition aircraft? How important is that? And do you see any sign that they might stop providing refueling?
No. I mean, even when they made this announcement about suspending the precision-guided weapons, they said that then they're not going to be suspending the refueling, and that really is crucial. If they stop the refueling, that would stop the bombing campaign literally tomorrow, because logistically the coalition would not be able to send their fighter jets in to carry out sorties without that help. And I think that's really the crucial part of it, and why people are pushing for more, because if the US government did want to stop the bombing campaign, they could do it straight away. So this is a kind of half-hearted sort of effort, really, by saying we're going to stop the precision-guided weapons and, you know, backs them away from being complicit maybe in war crimes so much, but they're still heavily involved in actually the whole campaign carrying on.
I'd like to turn to comments by the British Defence Secretary Michael Fallon. Speaking Sunday, he emphasised Britain's support for Saudi Arabia.
The government's view is absolutely clear that what Saudi Arabia is entitled to do is to defend itself from these attacks across its own border. It's had its cities in the south of Saudi Arabia have been shelled by the Houthis. It's perfectly entitled to defend itself, and it's also leading the coalition to restore the legitimate government of Yemen.
So why is the UK still supporting Saudi Arabia, and how does the situation in Yemen compare to what's happening in Syria?
Well, on that first question, really, I mean, the British are actually in far deeper water as far as the war crimes is concerned, because they're signatories to the Arms Trade Treaty. And in the Arms Trade Treaty, it says if there is any risk that weapons could be used in violations of international humanitarian law, and that's a pretty low bar, could be used, then they should be suspended. And anybody that's spent more than a couple of days on the ground in Yemen can see that it's not could be, it's highly likely. And even, you know, Human Rights Watch and other organisations have found evidence of British bomb remnants being used on civilian targets in Yemen. So absolutely they should be suspending, but there have been various arguments put forward by the British government, including that if we don't do it, somebody else will, which doesn't really help them out when you're trying to defend yourself
you mean
in violations
if we don't
of war
do
crimes.
it, someone else will make the money?
Yes, exactly. So this is going to come to a situation now in the High Courts in the UK in January where this issue is being challenged by activists who are trying to suspend those sales. But with a comparison with Syria, the humanitarian situation in Yemen is worse. It's far worse because it's the poorest country in the Middle East, and there was already an issue over malnutrition in Yemen before the war, and there was just no capacity to cope with any kind of restriction in food imports, as I've already mentioned. And there is no sort of middle class where people have disposable income in order to be able to pay to get themselves out of the country, which in the case of Yemen now, it's pretty much become an island. Even fishermen have been bombed in their boats off the coasts, which kind of rules out the option of going across the sea to get out of the country. And then the border is with Saudi Arabia, obviously, and that's sort of running the gauntlet if people are wanting to escape. So the humanitarian situation in Yemen is very much cut off from the rest of the world in that respect. And there was no capacity within the country of people being able to have a coping mechanism to deal with that. And even the impact of the Arab Spring we saw after the revolution in Yemen in 2011, the situation got bad, and that was just a year of political unrest. And now you're talking about 2 years of war, a restriction on imports, and that's why you've got, 18.8 million people now in need of some form of humanitarian aid, which is far worse than the figures that are coming out of Syria.
Well, can you say a little bit about, you've suggested that there's no resolution to the conflict in Yemen without also addressing other conflicts in the Middle East, in Iraq and in Syria, and also whether, as some claim, Yemen has now basically become a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Yes, I think, both of those questions run into each other, really. I mean, the conflict in Yemen started as a war between two presidents, really. The former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who then used the Houthis to take over the capital, Sana'a, and between him and his vice president, who used to be his vice president, who became the new president in 2012, President Hadi. Then, of course, once the Saudis got involved, because they see the Houthis as an ally to Iran and a proxy for Iran, really, it then fed into the regional power struggle, really, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so without those parties being involved, obviously Saudi Arabia as well, in the resolution, there is no way of getting to the intricate details of what needs to be broken down into a political solution for Yemen without removing those other parties, those regional parties that are involved in the conflict as well. So that's why if the Saudis are no longer involved in the military campaign in Yemen, it does actually make a resolution to the conflict in Yemen more possible and perhaps easier, because then you're dealing with local political dynamics rather than having to deal with regional ones.
And what about Iran, though?
Well, the claims over Iranian involvement in Yemen for many years have been really hard to find evidence of on the ground in Yemen, and I think it's very much overblown. There's a huge amount of paranoia in Riyadh about this, Certainly the Houthis are politically aligned to Iran, but there isn't the kind of involvement that you see, in Syria and places. There are not Iranian forces on the ground in Yemen. There has been more recent evidence, again, in the last few weeks of a trail of the weapons perhaps coming from Iran and serial numbers popping up on the ground then in the ground war. But actually, there are probably as many American weapons involved in the Houthis' hands because much of the military remained loyal to Ali Abdullah Saleh, and of course the Americans have been providing military support to Ali Abdullah Saleh for many years before the war even
started. As we begin to wrap up, I want to read a part of a 2015 Washington Post article, in part about General James Mattis. That's the man tapped by Donald Trump to be the next Secretary of Defense. The Washington Post reports, quote, Mattis lobbied for more interdictions of ships and planes carrying Iranian arms to battlefields such as Yemen and Syria. And Mattis pressed for more covert actions to capture or kill Iranian operatives. Talk about what Yemen will look like within a Trump administration and who, as Trump himself calls him, Mad Dog Mattis, is the significance of what he's saying.
I think there are a lot of unknowns at the moment, particularly because what has been said by Trump in the run-up to elections was sometimes contradictory. And also this whole issue, obviously, of being perhaps more sympathetic to Russia whilst being more hawkish to Iran when ultimately they're on the same side in the Middle East. It really leaves a lot more questions than it answers. I mean, certainly the impression I've been getting from Riyadh and out of Saudi Arabia over the last few weeks is that actually they think the Trump administration might be more favourable to them. And, of course, this means now we're kind of in a dead time now between now and inauguration at the end of January where everybody kind of waits to see what happens. And that means that, political negotiations that had already slowed down despite, efforts by John Kerry are now completely frozen.
So that means one child every 10 minutes continues to die in Yemen.
And it'll be more. I think it'll be more between now and the spring. The situation is not going to improve for them anytime soon.
Well, Iona Craig, we want to thank you very much for being with us. Iona has been based in Sana'a from 2010 to 2015 as the Yemen correspondent for the Times of London. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll go to Washington, D.C., as a Muslim registry is being talked about in a Trump administration, with the model being the Japanese-American internment camps. We'll go to a man who grew up in one of those camps. He's currently a congressman. Stay with us.
7 ليالي وشهور في حبك واليوم انت تجيني تتركني وتنساني من غيرك ما نكون انت في الحب أمير وانا في عيونك أسير قلتلي عنتر وعبلة حبك بكل لمسة أرجوك لا تغيب أنا في جنبك إحساس إنك أنت أغلى الناس.
You Are Arabian by Kabrit, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
On Wednesday, heads of the nation's top technology companies met with President-elect Donald Trump at Trump Tower. Among those attending were Apple CEO Tim Cook, Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg, and Amazon CEO Jeffrey Bezos. The meeting was organized by Trump transition team member, billionaire Peter Thiel, who famously drove the news website Gawker out of business by secretly bankrolling a controversial lawsuit by wrestler Hulk Hogan against Gawker Media. Wednesday's meeting reportedly focused on jobs and the economy. But there's another issue that's been getting some attention within the tech world: Donald Trump's proposal to build a national registry for people from Muslim-majority countries. Hundreds of tech workers have signed on to a pledge titled "Never Again," saying, quote, "We refuse to participate in the creation of databases of identifying information for the United States government to target individuals based on race, religion, or national origin."
Twitter became the first major tech company to say it would not participate in the creation of such a database. Facebook has also said it would not help Trump. A spokesperson for Facebook told CNN Money, quote, "No one has asked us to build a Muslim registry, and of course we would not do so." Last month, Carl Higbie, a spokesman for the pro-Trump Great America PAC, defended the proposed registry for all Muslim immigrants by citing World War II Japanese internment camps. He spoke with Fox News' Megyn Kelly.
We did it during World War II with Japanese, which, you know, call it what you will, maybe wrong.
You're not proposing we go back to the days of internment camps, I hope.
No, I'm not proposing that at all, Megyn. But what I am saying is that
you know better than to suggest that. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that gets people scared, Carl.
Right. But I'm just saying there is precedent for it, and I'm not saying I agree with it, but in this case, I absolutely believe that a regional-based...
You can't be citing Japanese internment camps as precedent for anything the president-elect is going to do.
Look, the president needs to protect America first, and if that means having people that are not protected under our Constitution have some sort of registry so we can understand, until we can identify the true threat and where it's coming from, I support it.
Among the many to criticize Higbie and the Trump team for proposing to build a Muslim registry is California Democratic Congressman Mike Honda, whose family was placed in a Japanese internment camp during World War II. Honda said in a statement, quote, "These remarks are beyond disturbing. This is fear, not courage. This is hate, not policy." Well, the U.S. government has issued a formal apology and paid reparations to some of the more than 120,000 Japanese Americans who were interned, two-thirds of whom were U.S. citizens. To talk more about one of the most shameful chapters in U.S. history, we go to Capitol Hill, where we are joined by Congressman Honda, who is representative of California's 17th District. Congressman Mike Honda, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about your own experience. When were you put in a Japanese internment camp? Where were you? Who was in your family?
Well, I was the infant, the first child of my parents, born in 1941. So by the time February 1942 rolled around, I was almost a year old. And I think that it was not only my family, but the entire 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry were removed from the West Coast into internment camps. And it was a massive, focused, probably the highest racial profiling that this country has ever exercised through Executive Order 9066.
And Congressman Honda, do you think internment camps of those kind can be set up again in the U.S.?
Oh, absolutely, they can be. And, you know, they talked about it not only about, you know, the current situation, but in the past few years, politicians and other folks have been talking about using internment camp types of approach to refugees and undocumented folks during the debate of the comprehensive immigration reform. So it's a concept and a strategy that a lot of people use.
Well, in an interview with ABC's George Stephanopoulos last year, Trump defended his proposal for a total and complete ban on Muslims entering the United States. He compared it to the detention of Japanese Americans, Germans, and Italians under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II.
What I'm doing is no different than what FDR's solution for Germans, Italians, Japanese, you know, many years ago.
So you're for internment camps?
This is a president who was highly respected by all. He did the same thing. If you look at what he was doing, it was far worse. I mean, he was talking about the Germans because we're at war. We are now at war.
So, Congressman Honda, can you respond to Donald Trump explicitly citing Japanese internment camps as a possible model?
Well, the reason that we came up with through the process of H.R. 442, an apology that President Reagan had signed that the Japanese American community had fought for 10 years, stated that there was 3 reasons why these camps had occurred: racial profiling, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. And basically what the president-elect is saying could be, well, in my opinion, would be a failure of political leadership, not only based upon ignorance. Well, it wouldn't even be ignorance because he already knows about it. It's just completely irrational and stupid, if I may use that word, because what he's talking about is Muslims. That's a religion, encompassing many ethnic groups, from Indonesians, Filipinos, to the people in the Middle East. Islam is a very large population. We're talking about Japanese Americans, Germans, and Italians. We were very specific groups. But racial profiling and profiling based upon religion, they're both wrong. And in this country, we should be protected in the Constitution. So I think that he was using a lot of this stuff not only to create fear, but to create a lot of intensity in terms of people looking at us, and it's just creating a lot of animosity and undue fear among people in this country. And so programs like this will be very important so that we educate people and make sure that they understand that that's the wrong way, wrong step, wrong direction, and it's very un-American.
Well, Congressman Honda, on Wednesday, the heads of nation's top technology companies, including Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, met with President-elect Donald Trump. And you're the representative of California's 17th district, where Google and Apple are based. What's your message to these technology companies?
Well, first of all, I just want to say the employees who had said never again, I want to take my hat off to them and also ask them to continue to advocate and educate people one-on-one. And that's one of the ways that we can turn this tide around. To the corporate leaders, I would hope that they use the same common sense about how to go about creating policies and advising the country, the leaders of this country, what directions to take and how to do that. The kind of things that we're talking about is not only about immigration, but it's also about the very foundation that this country has been founded upon. And that's making sure that all people who are on the soil are protected in the Constitution. And hopefully, when the president-elect takes his oath on January 20th, he understands that he's taking an oath to the Constitution and not to the government. And that means that he is swearing an oath to protect all of us here in this country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that includes folks who would misstep in protecting our country and protecting our citizens of this country under the title of national security. I just hope that we understand that clearly and make that clear distinction.
Last month, Congressman Honda, a member of Donald Trump's transition team, the Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach, who is still being considered for a top job, said the team is moving ahead with plans to reinstate a registry for immigrants from majority Muslim countries. He's the architect of anti-immigration laws in this country. Following 9/11, he helped design the registry for immigrants from majority Muslim countries known as the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System. The system dropped in 2011 after years of criticism from civil rights groups. Congressman Honda, you also voiced your opposition to this program in a letter to President Obama.
Yes. The idea of a Muslim registry, if you will, is, I think, in my mind, as a non-constitutional person, I'm not a constitutional attorney, but it seems to me that would be unconstitutional. And people will say, well, it's under the immigration laws, and all we're going to do is be looking at registering folks who are not citizens. But if we remember the experience of the Japanese Americans, the poster that assembled us and took us out of our homes and our neighborhoods and our communities, it said, all persons of Japanese ancestry, aliens and non-aliens alike, the government, even at that time, didn't have the courage to say citizens and non-citizens. And in my mind, all persons who are on the soil have the protection of the Constitution. They may say, well, it's under our constitutional purview to be able to do this and be able to register and keep an eye on all persons who are not citizens. But it's what you do with that registry what concerns me. And in World War II, when they gathered us up, the government broke the law again by using the census data, and the census data is supposed to be private. So I think that we still have to be vigilant about what our government does.
Very quickly.
And, go ahead.
Very quickly, Congressman Honda, before we conclude, over the course of the campaign, Trump also repeatedly called Syrian refugees terrorists. Can you tell us about the legislation you've just introduced, the Save the Children Act?
Certainly. The legislation is H.R. 6510, 6510. And the point of that legislation is to be able to put a marker on for the next Congress and to let people know that we're concerned about children between the ages of 3 and 10, and we want to be able to protect them and offer families who have children between the ages of 3 and 10 or orphans to be able to be brought here for temporary security and comfort and be able to keep them out of the harm's way. We must do that if we say that we are charitable or even concerned about what's going on overseas in Syria. What can be more American than to say to the youngsters and the families, give us your children, we'll hold them and we'll watch them, we'll take care of them temporarily until the Civil War is over. And I think that that's something that we should be able to do. We're a country with limitless resources, and yet our efforts seem to be falling way short of the things that we can do as possibility. And this is one of them.
On another topic, Congressman Honda, last year you tweeted a photo of you and your daughter Melissa saying, as a proud grandpa of a transgender grandchild, I hope she can feel safe at school without fear of being bullied. Can you talk about your grandchild? How old is she now?
She's 10 now.
10 years old.
And 10 years old. When she was about 18 months, she declared to the family that I'm a girl. And when she was just about 3 years old, she said, I'm a girl, my name is Melissa, and this is how you spell it. So she exhibited persistence, insistence, and consistency that told us that this is something that we have to join her journey, make sure that her journey is safe and secure. And this is the kind of security and safety that I was thinking about when we talked about providing the children of Syria and the orphans of Syria that kind of protection. It's no different.
Can you talk about legislative efforts to protect LGBTQ people? The advocates reporting the number of murders of transgender people in 2016 is officially the highest on record. At least 26 transgendered people have been murdered so far this year. Can you talk about your efforts?
Well, my effort is one that's joined by many other people who begin to understand that transgender is yet another group of folks that need to be protected and to be embraced. It took a long time for people just to be comfortable with the idea that the LGBs need to be protected and embraced and to understand them. And this is no different. And it's a massive instructional process where we have to start rethinking and reteaching ourselves the issue of gender identity, and move away from what we call the binary understanding of gender, that males and females. But there's a great spectrum between the two, and this is the effort that we're trying to do to make sure that people understand that every child is different, every person is different, and they're a gift of God. And in 10 seconds, have you taken a position on the DNC race? Are you supporting Keith Ellison, or Tom Perez is apparently announcing today? I endorsed Keith Ellison. when he said that he wanted to run for DNC. I was a past DNC vice chair, and I think that Keith Ellison will lend a great energy and direction and in thinking so that we can go back and recapture the White House.
Well, Democratic Congressmember Mike Honda of California, we thank you so much for being with us. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to a New York Times investigation. Who gets jailed? Who remains free? And what does money have to do with it? Stay with us.
My father came from Japan in 1905. He was 15 when he immigrated from Japan. He worked until he was able to actually build a store.
Let me tell you a story in the form of a dream. I don't know why I have to tell it, but I know what it means. Close your eyes, just picture the scene as I paint it for you. It was World War II when this man named Kenji woke up. Ken was not a soldier. He was just a man with a family who owned a store in LA. That day, he crawled out of bed like he always did, bacon and eggs with wife and kids. He lived on the second floor of a little store he ran. He moved to LA from Japan, they called him immigrant. In Japanese, he'd say he was called Issei. That meant first generation in the United States when everybody was afraid of the Germans, afraid of the Japs, but most of all afraid
Kenji
of the
by Mike Shinoda. Shinoda's father was interned at Manzanar, a Japanese internment camp in California. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We end the show today with a look at a New York Times investigation into a program that's meant to give criminal offenders a break, but often puts them in debt. The program is called pre-trial diversion. Prosecutors across the country often offer deals to offenders to drop cases and expunge records in exchange for sometimes onerous fees. Marcy Willis, an Atlanta single mother of 5, used her credit card to rent a car for a man in exchange for cash. The man disappeared with the car for 4 months, and after Willis found and returned the car, she was charged with a felony offense. As a first-time offender, Willis was offered pre-trial diversion at a cost of nearly $700. She was unable to pay the full cost. Willis told her story in a video that accompanied the New York Times article, After a Crime, the Price of a Second Chance.
I felt like it was all about money. So if you have the money, you can avoid prosecution, jail time, any of this. I see every day how people can get away with DUIs and everything because they can afford to pay for it. They have lawyers. I had to get a public defender. So, yeah, if I had money, it probably would have went away.
The New York Times investigation found, quote, in many places, only people with money could afford a second chance. Though diversion was introduced as a money-saving reform, some jurisdictions quickly turned it into a source of revenue. Prosecutors exert almost total control over diversion, deciding who deserves mercy and at what price, the article says. Well, for more, we're joined by the author of the piece, Shaila Dewan, national correspondent for the New York Times, reporter on the series No Money, No Mercy. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you.
Really important series. Now, we just heard Marcy Willis talk about the contrast in your piece to Rebecca Hoarding.
Rebecca Hoarding was a woman who was charged with texting while driving, and reckless endangerment, I believe, was the charge. She hit a girl who was riding her bicycle down the side of the road, causing brain damage and the loss of a leg. And she was offered pretrial diversion. She paid about $1,200, I believe, and is on course to have her case dismissed outright. So this is a deal that the prosecutor will make with you. Fulfill these conditions, and we'll dismiss your case. And in general, it's a pretty good progressive idea to give defendants a way out of the huge consequences of getting a record.
Except when it's related to money.
Right. So when money enters the equation, you find a lot of inequities, like the difference between Marcy's case, where she didn't hurt anyone.
And talk about her years-long struggle after that.
Yes, it was really gripping to talk to her just about the spiral downward. And the first thing that happened when she was charged was she lost her job. And even though she had diversion, meaning her case would ultimately be dismissed, it stayed there pending while she completed the program. She did the classes, she did the community service, she just couldn't come up with this final amount of money that she was supposed to pay. So they said, you know what, we're returning you to court, we are going to prosecute your case. And then, because of a backlog at the court, sat there for years as an open felony while she cycled through homelessness, joblessness, and she is only now just beginning to get back on her feet.
And do prosecutors have exclusive discretion in determining when to offer pre-trial diversion and to whom? And how do they determine how much defenders need to pay?
Prosecutors have so much discretion in this country. There is no oversight or higher authority often, so they have a lot of say over their diversion program policies, who can get it, who's excluded, and often, not in every case, but often they set the fees. So some states will say you can't charge more than X, $350, $500. Other times, they decide.
And then you have the prosecutors often requiring the defendants plead guilty before they can be offered pretrial diversion.
That's right. And there's a lot of debate about this in criminal justice circles. Is a guilty plea necessary or not? But it's essentially a matter of expediency. So let's say I give you diversion and you then, a few months later, you screw up and I want to prosecute you because you haven't done what you agreed to do. So I have to then mount the case against you as I would have months before without diversion. But instead I say, I'm going to give you diversion, but in exchange, you've got to plead guilty so that if you screw up later, we just go straight to sentencing. It's a lot easier for the prosecutor, but those guilty pleas have a lot of adverse consequences for the defendants.
And the money goes to the prosecutors themselves, is that right? Or
it's different in every jurisdiction, but we found many jurisdictions where, yes, the money is going to the prosecutor and often can be spent on almost any law enforcement purpose, which is very broadly defined.
Yet you write that Chicago is a more successful program.
Chicago has this incredibly well thought out program. The person who runs it has a clinical background, not a law enforcement background. And they have this wide range of available programs so that it's really tailored to the defendant's needs. You got caught with cocaine once. Maybe you don't need 6 months of rehab. Maybe you just need a little drug class, So they try to really calibrate the intervention to the defendant's needs, and that includes connecting them to services like health insurance. And you also find, there's a lot of evidence that shows now that over-punishing people or even requiring them to do too much has negative effects and can create more crime. So I think a lot of prosecutors that really believe in diversion would argue that it has a public safety goal. You're not throwing people in jail who just don't belong in jail, and instead you're addressing their issues in a different way.
Very quickly, can you tell us the story of Jarvis Bracey?
Oh, Jarvis. Jarvis was 21 years old. He was riding in a car with friends. He was drunk. Police officer thought he was underage, drinking, so pulled him out of the car. And the police officer said that when he spelled his name, he spelled it wrong. And now when he gave his Social Security, he gave it wrong, 2 digits off. Now, that's not a big deal. It could be just a misdemeanor. But Jarvis had unpaid traffic tickets. No criminal offenses, okay? We're talking about traffic tickets. And so he was arrested and charged with a felony.
How old is he?
He's now 25. He was 21 at the time that this happened.
We have
hauled
30
off
seconds.
to jail. And then he was offered diversion because it was his first offense, but he could not come up with the money. It was more than $3,000 it would have cost him to do diversion, and so he ended up convicted and now is carrying a felony record around with him for this drunken episode.
Are there any national standards?
There are national standards, but they're not binding. I mean, people have been really thoughtful and come up with standards for how these programs should work. You shouldn't have to plead guilty. Fees should not keep you out of it, but that doesn't mean prosecutors have to follow them.
Well, we will link to your pieces in the New York Times. Shiloh Dewan, national correspondent. The recent series, No Money, No Mercy, which examines how money undermines reforms to America's criminal justice system. And that does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Carla Wills, Laura Gaddis, Dina Guzder, Sam Malkoff, Robbie Karen, Honey Masood, Charina Nadura, Andre Lewis, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Liguera, Paul Huckabee, our engineer. Special thanks to Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks for joining us.